God entered the promised land, they knew one name, one God, Yahweh. Didn't know Jesus yet, but still had one beautiful name that they relied on for all of their needs. And yet those needs had been met while they were slaves, while they were wanderers, and while they were shepherds. And as they enter the promised land, they're becoming something different than that. It's time for them to become farmers, to live in a land flowing with milk and honey, to learn how to work the ground, to see sustenance come from God, but through the work of their hands. And when they get there, they've never done that before. And so they look at the world around them, particularly the Canaanites that live in the land, and they begin to see how they do this farming thing. They watch as when rain is needed, they go to a certain temple or a certain mountaintop, and they pray to the god Baal for rain. They watch as they hope that the wind would blow or that the sun would shine. They go to a different mountaintop or in a different altar, and they pray to a different God for sun or for wind or for whatever it is they need. And the people of God come into the promised land knowing one name, but it doesn't take long until there's a multitude of names. And they've taken this worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel that they've known, and as they've come into the promised land knowing they're only supposed to worship one God, they've fallen into the trap of culture, and they've begun to worship Baal, and they've begun to worship Asherah, and they've begun to worship Egyptian gods, and they'll end up worshiping Babylonian gods and Persian gods, and they find themselves conflicted at every moment with how they will get the things they need. This has been happening over a long period of time, and as the kingdom has split, it's been 62 years of cultural decline, 62 years of turning away from God and towards the worship of other false gods. And this has been led by their kings. King Ahab's on the throne at this time, and he's married Jezebel, one of the priestesses of a false god, Baal and Asherah. And she has brought with her prophets of those gods, and they've set up temples of worship for them. It's after 62 years of that Elijah shows up on the scene, and he comes to King Ahab and says, something has to change. I'm here on behalf of the God of Israel, the God I serve, Yahweh, and until I speak it, there won't be any more rain. And then he leaves and finds himself in hiding for 3.5 years. And for 3.5 years, not a drop of rain comes on the land flowing with milk and honey. And people who sustain themselves by farming aren't able to farm anymore. People who sustain themselves with the grazing of livestock can't find places for their livestock to graze anymore. And after 3.5 years, God speaks to Elijah again and says, it's time. Go back and meet with Ahab again. We began to look at this last week, but 1 Kings 18 tells this story starting in verse 16. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. A meeting is being set up between Elijah and Ahab, and when he, Ahab the king, sees Elijah, he says to him, is that you, you troubler of Israel? The man with all of the power, at least the human power, looks at Elijah and says, you're the one who caused all of this. You're the one who brought all of this trouble. You're the one who's conspired with the dark forces to make this bad. Is that you that I see? He's been searching for him for years, likely wanting to kill him. And standing in front of the man who has all of the power to take his life, Elijah responds this way, I've not made trouble for Israel. Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. You're the ones that have made this bad, and you've made it bad by bringing them into worship of a false god. You and your father and your family are the ones in charge of all of this trouble. It's because you've turned towards Baal and towards Asherah, towards false gods and towards false worship. You've turned towards the one God you were supposed to serve, and you have led the people of God towards serving and following a multitude. Something needs to be done about it. And so while standing against the man who has all of the power to kill him, Elijah says, you're the one that's the problem, and here's what we're going to do. And he begins to stack the odds for an experience. Verse 19 says it this way. Now, Elijah says to the king, summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel, the king's wife, who eat at your wife's table. Come meet me. Bring all of Israel to Mount Carmel, best translated as the mountain of the vineyard. Maybe the place where it would have been the most fertile in Israel's history, flowing with milk and honey. And he says, let's go there where we used to see all of the green grass, where it's brown now, where we've been praying for rain and where you've set up worship for your God of rain who hasn't provided. Let's go to his home turf and bring all of his prophets. And bring all of his wife's prophets, Baal and Asherah, the male and female gods of the Phoenician people. Bring the 850 prophets before me. This is the setting we're going to do. We're going to go to their home turf and we're going to get 850 to 1. And so it says in verse 20 that Ahab does that. He sends for all of the people of Israel, and the people of God come and they gather themselves to watch what Elijah is going to do. And as the assembly is there, as the 850 prophets are gathered around Elijah, he looks at all of the people and he asks them a question. He says it this way. Elijah went before the people and he said, how long will you waver between two opinions? That's what the NIV translation says. There's other translations you may have that will replace the word waver with something about limping. How long will you limp around? How long will you be kind of broken and indecisive on where you're going? Why are you delaying the decision? Why are you delaying your health? My favorite version of the translation is one that says, how long are you going to keep hobbling around on two crutches? How long are you going to have some need that you can't meet, and you're going to keep trying to hobble between lots of different things, deciding how it's supposed to get met? Because the people of God, they came into Israel and said, we know who Yahweh is. He's the one who has freed us from slavery. He's the one who's fought the victories for us. He's the one who spread this Jordan River so we could go through it, and we rely on him. But when it comes to farming, we were told by the Canaanites that we need to take what we need, the brokenness we have, and we need to go over to where Baal is. And we need Baal to show up, and so we pray to him that he would bring rain for us. And yet while we're in the famine and before the rains come, we remember that God provided the manna. And so we hobble back over to God and we say, could you miraculously provide manna until we can do it with our own hands again? And so they hobble broken back and forth. And then some of them think, oh, but my family, it's not growing the way I want. I want more fertility. I want more prosperity. And so if the goddess Asherah could provide that, and they take the needs of their life, the things they're missing, their brokenness, and they're wavering back and forth, limping between opinions and gods. Elijah's not there to say, hey, you've started worshiping Baal instead of God, and that's a problem. He's there and he's saying, you're worshiping Baal and God, and that won't work. You need to get your needs met by God and by God alone. As long as you're aiming to see it come from any other thing than God, you've missed out. In fact, he ends the question that way. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. As long as you're limping back and forth on your crutches, as long as you're hobbling around, you will never be made whole. Decide. Decide if it's going to be God, or if it's going to be Baal or Asherah or any other thing. But stop limping around. It's a simple question. How long? And we may look at them and we'd say, it is silly of a group of people to understand a God who has freed them from slavery, who has parted seas and rivers for them, who has defeated kings and kingdoms for them at nothing more than the blast of a trumpet, to then turn and worship other gods and pretend that they will get their needs met in other ways. And yet that's the culture they fell into. And when we're honest, it's the culture we fall into. We begin to do the same kinds of things. We come on Sunday and we say, I'm here and I want to worship God. I want to live my life for him. That's what matters to me. That's where I'll get all of the provision of life. And then on Monday we walk to work and we say, no, it's really my paycheck and my bank account that matters. And if my needs are going to get met in this world, it's by the work of my hands and what I can provide for my family. Oh, but I recognize I messed up and I sinned, and so I need God to restore me and give grace to me and have mercy on me. And so I will plead in confession and prayer with God to be merciful with me. But then on Friday night, I want to impress people and I want to party, and so I'm going to find my needs to get met there. And then we say, God, I'm hopeful for the way that you would provide for my family. I want you to bless me with my kids coming back to you, or with my spouse learning of who you are, and that we can celebrate who you are together. And then I also want people to like me. And so I'm going to manipulate who I am in relationships so that I get a reputation and a name. And we limp and we hobble back and forth because there's something deep and missing within us, and we think we can find it in all the ways the world tells us to. And while may it not be altars to Baal or Asherah, we're wavering. Elijah's calling them to a point of decision. I think today we'll be called to a point of decision. And he says to them, stop wavering. You need to decide who's God. And then you need to serve him. But the people said nothing. They sat silent. And so Elijah sets something else up as an experience for them to see clearly who God is. He says, okay, I'm the only God, the prophet of God left. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal before me. Let's stack the odds, 450 to 1. And here's what we'll do. We'll bring in 2 bulls. And we're on the home turf of the prophet of Baal at his vineyard. And we'll bring the 450 his, and they can pick their bull first and then prepare wood and a sacrifice. And then I'll take whichever bull is left, and I'll prepare wood and a sacrifice, and we'll each cry out to our gods. And whichever one's bull burns up, whichever sacrifice is accepted, that's God. That's who will be God. Verse 24 records the end of that. It says, call on the name of your God, I'll call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people of God, all the people of Israel that have been gathered from around the nation are there, and they say, what you say is good. Let's do that. Let's see today if it's Baal or if it's Yahweh, if it's God or if it's what the culture has always said to be true. Let's see who shows up in fire. And so the prophets of Baal choose a bull, and they prepare it, and they put it on the wood. And they don't light the fire. And they begin to call. Verse 26, they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar they had made. Baal, where are you? Come light this thing on fire. Show everybody your God. And it stays silent. 3 hours or so, it stays silent. And as Baal's not answering, they began, it says in the verses, dancing around the altar they made. I want to make sure you do not picture beautiful ballet. Their dancing is one of seductive lust. Think of every kind of awful thing you can think about with erotic worship in the Old Testament, and picture that kind of dancing around an altar. In front of all of God's people, they are seductively dancing around an altar, trying to lure their God into the place. They've been shouting, they've been singing, they're dancing, hoping Baal will show up. But there was no response. No one answered. At noon, it says Elijah began to taunt them. He's standing alone in front of the 450 who have been for hours dancing and shouting, and nothing's happening. And so he starts putting fuel to the figurative fire. He says, shout louder. Maybe you understand he's a God, but perhaps he's deep in thought, or he's busy, or he's traveling. Or maybe he's sleeping and he must be awakened. You're not shouting loud enough, or maybe it's that he can't hear you. Maybe it's that he's thinking about other things. When it says he's busy, it's better to be translated, maybe he's on the toilet. Maybe he's otherwise occupied. Maybe he's not on his kingly throne, he's on his other throne. He just doesn't hear you at this point. Maybe he's gone, traveling. Or maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. This particular area of the region, the Canaanites, as they worshipped their God, particularly the God of the rain and fertility and provision for the land, they assumed that he slept during the winter. That's why things died. And so they had annual celebration services that were to awaken their gods. You say, maybe you messed up then. Maybe he's still asleep. Maybe you haven't woken him back up. You got do those things. Get his attention. And instead of saying, hey, you, be quiet, it's 450 of us to one, they actually take his advice. It says, so they shouted louder. And they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. They've shouted. They've danced. They've cut themselves with swords to bleed. They're frantic. And we may look at it and say, how silly does that look? Dancing, shouting, cutting of themselves, frantically trying to get the attention of God, frantically trying to get your needs met in a way that the culture around you has done before. That'll never work, right? And yet we look at our own lives and we do similarly frantic kinds of things. We find ourselves hoping to impress people with the things we have, but we look and our bank account has no money. So we go into debt. We might not literally cut our body with the swords, but we cut our bank accounts to say, I want to impress other people. I need to get the things that provide for me. We might not cut ourselves and dance erotically to try to get the attention of a God, but we might do everything within our power to change our body to get the attention of other people. We might starve ourselves or binge and eat. We might change how we dress, change how we look, change what kinds of makeup we put on or how we've done our hair. We might do anything and everything to become something we're not really, just to get the attention of other people. We might understand that there's things that have gone wrong in our lives, and the appropriate thing would be to walk into tension and confrontation and difficulty and deal with them. But instead we say, you know what, I found a better way. I'll drink to the bottom of this bottle. And that'll solve my problems. And we run around doing silly things, maybe not cutting our bodies or dancing seductively, but we are frantic. Limping back and forth saying, God, I want you to show up and bless me and do the things you've promised to do, but at other times I just want to impress people in my own way. And so instead of you providing for me and instead of relying on you, I'm going to do what the culture has said to get my way, and we limp and we waver, and Elijah cries out and God cries out, how long are we going to keep trying it this way? How long are we going to keep doing the frantic things that don't sustain? Because when we do those things, if we're sincere and we're honest and we look from the big picture, no one's answering. No one's paying attention. It's not getting any better. And so then Elijah says to all the people, come here to me. And he draws the people of God to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. He looks and says, the things that have been broken, let me start to rebuild that. It goes on to say he took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. And with these stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He doesn't just come to say, watch what I can do. Before that, he brings and invites the people of God with him, and he says, let me remind you of what God's done before. Let me build an altar like he's done before. Remember how he'd taken 12 stones out of the Jordan when we celebrated who God was? The tribe you're a part of was there, and God believes in you. He counts you. You're one of his people. You're chosen. Remember this identity God's had for you. And he makes this altar that reminds them of what God has done before. He builds life into them of how God has worked on their past before. And then it says, and he digs a trench around. In fact, a slide's going to come. It's going to show you all sorts of things he did. He builds an altar with a stone. He digs a trench around it enough to hold 2 seahs of seed, and he arranged the wood. He cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood, and then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. And the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. You've got before you 450 prophets who have tried shouting, they've tried dancing, they've tried cutting themselves where blood is now flowing and sprinkling around the altar they've made. And then on the other side, you've got somebody who willingly stacks the odds against him. He's not only prepared the altar with wood, he's then doused it with water. 4 jars, 3 times, 12 jars of water poured out. It says it didn't just cover the wood. They had to dig a trench. He made a moat around it, and everything is flooded. Everything is flooded. He says they've been calling for their God to show up in fire, and we haven't heard a sound. We haven't seen a spark. Nothing has happened. And as the evening is hitting, the time of the sacrifice is upon them, and the prophet Elijah steps forward and he begins to pray. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I'm your servant, and that I've done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. We've watched for hours people cry out to these other false gods, and there's been no answer. God, answer me." Not, "God, answer me so that they'll be judged. God, answer me and show who you are so that everybody feels guilty." Not, "God, answer me and then bring wrath on the people that you're against, though his wrath will come." It's, "God, answer me so that people will know you're God and so that their hearts will turn back to you. Let them see how you're still at work in their lives, even though they've been wavering and limping. Show up in a way that they can decide that they'll no longer hobble around on crutches. They'll know, I'm going to stay with God. He's the only one I need. I'm going to plant my foundations on Him, and I'm going to stop trying to do it all the other ways. Please show up and answer me." And after one simple prayer, the climax of the story comes simple and sweet. And then the fire of the Lord fell, and it burned up the sacrifice and the wood and the stones in the soil. And it also licked up the water in the trench. Elijah prays again one big prayer, and God answers. 65 years of cultural decline, 3.5 years of famine. And God shows up in front of Israel, and they respond. When the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Worship breaks out because God showed Himself to them. They recognize Baal is no longer who they should aim for anything. The provision of the fire, the provision of the rain, the fertility of the land. That God alone is God. That He alone provides. That He alone meets the needs. And that it is not worth limping back and forth anymore. And the judgment does come. Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." And they seized them. And Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. The people of God witness. God show up and Baal stay silent. And they begin to worship God, and they watch as the prophets of Baal are slaughtered. And the one man who took on 850 stands victorious in front of them. A simple answer to the question, how long? And they say, apparently till the fire of God shows up. Apparently about another 9 hours. And then we'll know. And the question for us rings out, how long? I want to remind us that question, as Elijah's asking it, is not being asked of people who don't know God. It's being asked of the people of God themselves. And so as we're here, a gathered people of God, how long? How long are we going to keep trying to do it our way and add God onto the side? How long are we going to say, I believe in God, I understand God, I like God, He's worked well for me in a number of situations, but I'm still going to do some other things the way the culture does it? How long are we going to limp about? And I would hope the answer would be no longer. We're going to decide today that God is God and we'll serve Him. That money's not God, that our reputation isn't God, that our looks aren't God, that our family isn't God. God alone is God, and we will serve Him and Him alone. Experience ends, and Elijah's there. And he wants to close the loop. 3.5 years ago, he stood before Ahab and said, it won't rain until I say it will rain again. Rain still hasn't come, just fire now. So he's going to close that loop. He goes to Elijah goes to Ahab, verse 41, and he says this to him. Go, eat and drink, for there's the sound of heavy rain. I want to let you in on a secret. We learn this in the next couple of verses. There's no rain yet. Elijah speaks it, but it's not there. Everybody could have heard him and looked around and be like, I don't hear anything. I don't see anything. But Ahab takes this man at his word. How could you not? The fire just showed up and the 450 just died. And so he goes off to eat, it says. But Elijah climbs to the top of Carmel, to the top of the vineyard, and he bends down to the ground and puts his face between his knees and prays big prayers again to God, probably, though not recorded, that He'd send rain. And while he's at the top, down on the ground with his face between his knees, pleading to God that the rain would come, that Israel would see their sustenance from Him again, he says, go and look toward the sea. He told his servant, and he went up and looked. I want to pause there for a moment. Just, where did his servant come from? For 3 weeks he's been alone. There's been no servant. Suddenly Elijah has a servant. And here's my best guess. When you stack the odds that heavily against you, when you stand against 850 others, you pray the big prayer, and it comes true, and God works through you in that way, lots of people will happily do what you ask next. Suddenly Elijah has a servant, and so while he's praying, he says to his servant, go and look toward the sea. The servant went and looked and said, there's nothing there. Go back. He comes back a second time. There's nothing there. Go back. Comes back a third time. There's nothing there. You sure you're looking towards the sea? Yeah. Go back. Sorry, Elijah, still don't see anything. Could you go again? Still nothing. All the while he's proclaimed to Ahab, can't you hear the sound of heavy rain? We've given our hearts back to God, and He's showing up. He's been promised to be faithful to us. We can speak about it. We're so confident it's going to happen even before we see it, even before we hear it. The sound of rain's coming. Go back. And after the 7th time, the servant reported, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. It had been just pure blue. He says, no, this time I see a small cloud. He says, oh, you better go tell Ahab to hurry up. You better get on his chariot and start going. If he wants to beat the rain, imagine someone's like, this is just like a small hand of a cloud. But it says, meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, and the wind rose, and a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off. And immediately, as Elijah prays, after 7 times of seeing nothing and after hearing nothing, even though he's out loud in front of everybody, God's going to show up, He's going to remain faithful. Can't you hear the sound of heavy rain? And they all say, no, we don't believe it yet. And Elijah says, you should believe it. It's coming. You better start running before it shows up because a storm is on the horizon. They're like, no, that's a small cloud. And he's like, you better wait. And then out of nowhere, Dark clouds fill the sky. The sun's no longer seen. It's not shining anymore. The wind picks up and a heavy rain shows. And the people of God, no doubt, are celebrating the sustenance coming from God again. He showed up in fire to prove himself to them, and he shows up in rain to provide for them. And they celebrate. And the truth is, I believe, as Elijah's an ordinary man just like us, with a nature just like ours, that God still works this way. That he wants us to be not wavering between two options, trying to figure out how we solve our brokenness. No, he wants us to be prostrate before him with our head between our knees, proclaiming his faithfulness even before we see it. He wants us to have boldness and faith to be able to say, God, I trust in your goodness, and I'm so aligned with how you're going to work in this world that I can hear the sound of heavy rain before it's even started. Because you will sustain and you will provide. And he wants us to have the confidence and faith to believe that still. But it's not because he shows up in fire to prove himself to the world anymore. No, he did that in the Old Testament. He's shown up differently now. It's not on Mount Carmel, it's on the Mount of the Skull. It's not on an altar of wood, it's on a cross made out of wood. And it's not drenched with the water of the jars that have been poured on it, it's drenched with the blood of Christ himself. It's strikingly similar, some of the picture of going from the pure light and cloudless sky to the darkness that overtakes when God is showing up to turn his people's hearts back to him. This is what it says in Luke chapter 23, talking about Jesus on the cross. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. For the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, and Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. Nathan's going to come join me in just a moment. We're going to have worship played as we celebrate communion together. Where hopefully, before we take the elements, we can all answer a simple question. Simple question asked by Elijah. How long are you going to waver between two opinions? How long are you going to limp from God to the other thing that you think sustains you? How long are you going to, in your brokenness, hobble on crutches undecided? And the hope response we would be like they had to fire falling is one that we would have to Jesus dying on our behalf. And we would say, I don't need to wait any longer. My camp's with Jesus. My foundation is in him. He's the Son of God and my Savior, and I'm going to serve him and him alone. I don't need it to come through my finances. I don't need it to come through my looks. I don't need it to come through my relationships. I will be with God. And I'll be so confident in Jesus' goodness to me that I will hear the rain before it starts. That I'll put my face between my knees and proclaim the clouds in the sky before they're there. And then I will celebrate when it turns dark. And the rain falls, and God sustains again, and he turns our hearts back to rightful worship of him. God asks us as his people, how long will we keep trying it another way? And my hope today is that we could answer confidently, it's done now. My faith's in Jesus. I'm going to worship him and serve him and him alone. In a few moments, the ushers are going to distribute elements, bread and a cup.